So this is the walkthrough of course 506 or Open RAN security. And basically, since this is going to be um, a new setup, no, from the initial, no, deployment of what first generation 2G, 3G, 4G, and even current 5Gs, no, where it was a monolithic single vendor deployment for the most part, and we're now trying to break up modules, no, and components. Security was very what do you call this, of utmost concern, since you're going to be talking to various vendors, no, instead of just one, and you'll be mixing and matching a lot of this systems, no, to make Open RAN work. And as far as we've when we've done our you call this benchmarking, like case study earlier this year, no, for a lot of the learnings that I encountered was they were testing for interoperability and performance. They are secure by design, no, but very minimal of security testing, no, what I've encountered with them. No. So for this course, I'll say this is a bit more intermediate, no, rather than basic, since it's discussing security. So a lot of the concepts of Open RAN would have been we're expecting, no, the students to have it before taking this course, and some I would say Python coding and Linux background is warranted, especially for the exercise. But for the course content, I mean, it could stand on its own. But once we do the course exercises, you'll need some background in basic virtualization and setting up of Linux machines, and then we'll test the security concept there. So for our topic, we'll be discussing ORAN threat modeling, security controls and risks, zero trust architecture, the NIST cybersecurity framework, and then the CIS critical security controls and benchmark. And then we'll wrap up the course with the key learning points, no, and that list of references. So in Open RAN security, what does open actually mean? No? And open, it's does not necessarily mean open source, no, or free. No? The open part here really is, as discussed with other courses, is for interoperability. No? It's, yeah, again, the intentional capability of the software, hardware, and or interfaces to comply on agreed upon standards. No? So we would be most likely using open source software, but again, it does not necessarily mean that it could be only open source. For vendors, no, of various components or even end to end, no, if they would claim that they are Open RAN compliant and they have all the parts. They may use open source and they would likely be using open source, no, but their proprietary code could also be incorporated there, no, which, well, would mean closed source. We all also might be discussing open source hardware, right? And for open source hardware, um, yeah, some designs, architecture might be open source by various vendor, no, but this does not necessarily mean that if you design and create a component for Open RAN, you are required to do open source, no, unless you are basing your design from an open source hardware. But yeah, mainly it's really open interfaces, no, where we are referring when we say Open RAN. So as mentioned, ORAN Alliance, open is for interoperability, not necessarily meaning open source. And for ORAN security, no, we have various subsets, no, like threat modeling and remediation analysis. This is the most mature, since a lot of this is also based on 3GPP standard. There are requirement specification. It is already mature, but there are still work being incorporated in the requirement specification. For protocol specification, like they're focusing basically on known secure protocols, no? Like TLS, DTLS, SSH, and IPsec. So you won't be seeing any telnets here. Everything should already be on SSH, no? Secure shell. And then for component-to-component communication, you are required to do TLS, even if it's within the same subnet. Since there's a discussion on zero trust, even if you are, on supposedly an isolated network, you're processing various API calls, uh, you typically would not want to trust, no, that your data being transmitted to another component in Open RAN is gonna get sniffed, no? So hence you need to protect all of this information per component. Okay. Then we have test specification. It's in progress. We'll have some discussions on this. But a lot of this also is stemming from 3GPP. So current state, again, and security challenges. For O1, A1, any other 3GPP related interfaces, and open fronthaul interface and open fronthaul CS plane, no? They are already available. Um, For the others, no, yung mga E2, O2, XR apps, OSC softwares, while it says here that they are supposed to be released, no, in 2021, there is already something. It's still being updated as I speak. And then, of course, yung secure physical assets, this a lot of them are basing on ISO 27001, no, to protect um, yung mga physical deployments like cell sites and data centers. No? And well, they are basically passing the buck for this dun sa sa operators. Okay. Then with that intro, no, basically we're saying here that yeah, Open RAN deployments are somehow, no, less secure to a degree, no, than traditional single vendor deployment approach, for the reason that, diba, there are various groups developing various components, and even if you're able to interact, no, with all of these components and working seamless, no, we all know that developing systems, even if it's a single vendor deployment, I'm just not singling out multi-vendor deployment, um, there are components that might not be needed, that is introduced, no? Maybe some test codes, some debug systems that weren't taken out into production, no? And this basically is amplified with the number of vendors that you are now operating on. And there is ORAN, Alliance Security Task Group, that well engaged with the working groups, no, to tackle security challenges on all Open RAN interfaces. So with that, there is going to be short reading, no, on Open RAN policies on security in 5G. It's just a 4-pager. I did estimate half hour, no, with 1-pager key highlights, no, for the course, no, to be submitted. And then there's the NIS operation group, no, report on cybersecurity in Open RAN. This one is a bit longer, no, than the 4 pages. It's 31 pages, and we're estimating 2 hours. And then again, just some summary highlights and takeaways, no, from that documentation. Next, we have ORAN security risk, no. Basically, we want to protect, no, the expanded threat surface, since this is not a single vendor deployment anymore. Typically want to be protected if, let's say, one device or one component was compromised, and we needed to determine ano yung nangyayari on sorry, if one component is being attacked, and where's it coming from, and chances are it's one of those components were compromised, and it's attacking other systems within Open RAN. So we need to close, no, security vulnerabilities associated especially with the near real-time controller, no, and then address threat to trust chain introduced by the coupling of functions. Again, yeah, we are now dealing with various components and a lot of vendors, no? And if that one vendor was compromised, no, like let's say like SolarWinds, no? When they were compromised, the threat actor had access to their source code and injected backdoors, no? And when the customers downloaded the patch, no, it included the backdoor. Okay. Next, we also want to ensure, no, management interfaces are secured according to industry best practice. And well, the best way to do it is do whitelisting, no, on each and in every interfaces. And if you could have some components of application-based filtering, let's say web application firewall, no, since a lot of this would be web-based, no, API calls. So you do filter with IP address on, let's say, which components could talk to the A1 interfaces, limit that list to specific hosts. And then again, if you are expecting specific API calls, no, there is format, there is parameters. No? If you have a very good web application firewall, no, you could start defining those calls, no, and any anomalous or out of the ordinary request, no, that wasn't accounted for during the UAT and staging environment, you could filter that out and send an alert to the monitoring team. So that's part of the best practice, no. And then of course practice higher level of due diligence, no, because a lot of OpenRAN components would likely, no, be using open source. And I'm not singling out again OpenRAN. No? A lot of softwares right now are using open source components. No? So there could be a possibility that one open source module na had public vulnerability and a public exploit was released. So now we have to identify a lot of the libraries that we're going to be using and be on the lookout, no, if there is a specific vulnerability that was published, no. We want to assess, are we affected? Is the version we're using affected? What's our level of exposure, no? Is this component could be reached out by using public traffic, no? Let's say from either from the internet or from the users, no, or subscribers of let's say via mobile phone or mobile data. So we need to ensure that we would have less exposure. So a classic example of this would be, let's say the Log4j vulnerability, 2 years ago, where even a lot of vendors, no, weren't actually aware that they were using Log4j on their components. No? Uh, and what we saw there was it's basically a live disclosure of vulnerable components. No? And every hour we were checking the page on, and various security researchers were uh, contributing to that list, no? On which software has Log4j and what version and are they affected. So everyone's on the watch list. Again, even major vendors like I saw that, no, like VMware, no, weren't aware that some of their major systems, no, were using Log4j as their logging mechanism. And then of course implement defenses from physical attacks. No? Now for the threat modeling, we are identifying assets and threats. Against for assets, we have 3 data and interface assets and 12 component assets. Then threats against it, no? ORAN, OCloud, of course, the open source software, physical, attacks against radio networks, and this one is a bit, I would say, new, no? The attack against machine learning. And there are various studies and some POCs, no, on how to manipulate machine learning by introducing um, say traffic, no, or information, no, that is being ingested by machine learning and gonna be used in the future, no. And we're calling it adversarial machine learning. If we could introduce a malicious traffic and the machine learning component would treat that as normal, then you might be able to attack it. Then aside from that, now we have stakeholders. Now we could identify stakeholders in the threat modeling. MNOs, technology providers, tech admins, integrators and testers, and of course yung what we're protecting against, no, the attackers, which basically is one of this list. So either cyber criminals who want, of course, most of this has some hidden agenda. No? Either they are against the organization, or but for cyber criminals, it's mainly for profit. There are cyber terrorists. These are they have some beliefs system that you are against them and they want to cause you harm. There's also the political aspects of it, no, like the activists and nation states threat actors. Since this is gonna be OpenRAN is gonna be used in critical infrastructure slash communication infrastructure. Various nation states would want access to your infrastructure, and they would move heaven and earth, no, to gain access to that. And I've seen uh, a lot of this nation state either compromise, let's say, a supply chain, no, to have one of their implants and modules incorporated on your components, or even buy, employees, via insider threat to execute some code, have an implant on one workstation, and they'll do the rest. And for insider threat, again, some of them are not necessarily motivated by money. Others are just disgruntled employee against the organization, which is very hard to detect since they had access. Um, Others naman, it's more of they were threatened, no, by, let's say, a nation state, no, to perform on their behalf. We also encountered that on some of my investigations before. And again, one of the most concerning part actually here will be the insider threat, because they could be colluded, no, but and intimidated by cyber criminals, cyber terrorists, and nation state, no, to perform stuff on their behalf, and it's hard to detect, no, which is real and which is not. On one case, let me tell a story. Ransomware here in the Philippines. No? They had an insider, and what they instructed with the insider is, we're gonna send you an email. So just open that attachment and double click and then execute the macro, and then we'll do the rest. With We are highly likely sure that that employee was part of the incident. We're not sure if it was through intimidation or monetary benefit or both. No, but on our part, no, it's hard to basically pinpoint that, even though we're highly likely sure, no, it's hard to pinpoint that he was colluding with a threat actor, because what he just did was open up a weird email and then double click the attachment and run it. That's it. And yeah, it cost the organization uh, a very expensive, no, learning experience just with that. And then part of this would be security measures, no? Inside threat modeling documentation, inside requirement specification documents, protocol specifications, and then we'll do risk assessment, no? And tag, no, various components and risks that we have identified as either low, medium, or high severity. So for the threat modeling, this is how they are interacting with. I got this from Security Gen. It's uh, once you have defined the asset, okay, and threats, you try to now start mapping, no, these threats to asset on the third component. And what you want to do here is basically identify, no, which data asset is part, no, of what ORAN threat and what other threats, no, could be identified on those specific components. And we could now start assigning, no, risk level, again, dependent on four uh, major component on the risk rating. For security, we are always, sorry, it's five, no? For security, yung pinaka-common was the CIA, no? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. No? But now we have a component of privacy, no? And authorization. So we are now considering five risk type in Open RAN. This is an expansion, no, from our the vanilla security that you only deal with confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Okay. So we have here a sample risk analysis, no, based on BSI. It's a German company. Like from the victim's perspective, no, is the victim the end user, the state, or the telecom operator? And we would also be factoring in, no, let's say who's gonna attack us? Is it the end user that's using our mobile device? Is it an outsider, no, from the organization? Or it could be combined, no? An outsider pretending to be an end user by getting a SIM card or access to our infrastructure. Could be an insider. It could also be a RAN, no, service provider, no, or a cloud service provider. Kasi we've seen some sample of it on SS7 attacks, no, with various rogue telcos, no, that's redirecting users to their infrastructure for an intelligence agency to sniff, no, the call and the messages passing through or destined, no, for a target victim. And for BSI, no, they also identify assets, no, o cloud interfaces, apps, and machine learning, and which targets, which risk type, no, are being targeted. Are they targeting confidentiality? Are they targeting the integrity of the information or the availability of the system? No? Even just downing one component Open RAN could mean outage, no, full outage. Um, and of course, the authenticity, no, and privacy of our how do you call this? The data, no, that's being operated on and processed in Open RAN. For security measures, there are two based on BSI. No? It's either the base one would be, of course, 3GPP oriented, no? And there's also the ORAN based security measures. But I would say a lot of the ORAN are newer, no? Of course, than 3GPP, but it's based on 3GPP. It was just an upgraded part. And then we'll do BSI did risk assessments like low, medium, or high, no? Based on risk rating. And I like how BSI did this, no? When they have this table, no, per risk, and they would say, no, okay, from like example here, from the perspective of the stakeholder, no? And we have, let's say, the end user, the state, and network operator. How vulnerable are they, no, for an outsider attack? As you can see here, no, maraming green, so they are actually protected for confidentiality, integrity, except for availability, no? So availability again, one rogue mobile phone, no, could cause an outage on a vulnerable cell tower, no? And that's from an outsider perspective, no? And well, again, outsider could also be a user, so they are incorporating that thing, no? But if you could see on this basic table, no, if it was an insider, um, an insider could easily attack, no, an end user, a state, and most components ng network operators, no? But again, it's most likely that they just don't have direct access to other systems that could impact confidentiality and integrity. But for availability and authenticity, it's no-brainer, no, if it's an insider. Okay. And yeah, it's just an example, no, on one subset, no, that I extracted from the BSI documentation for their 5G RAN risk analysis. Okay. And it's gonna be a required reading for this course. No? So this was a bit lengthy. No? It's around 79 pages. It's technical, especially if you're not into security. No? So we're estimating around 5 hours of reading here, and of course we'll also be requesting I know this um key highlights, no, report on how you understood this and maybe some use case, no, if I'm implementing this module, these are stuff that I want to uh, consider, no. Okay. So next we'll have some discussion lang, no, on service management and orchestration top risk, no? Like if you have information of network information data, no? Where are these configurations and topologies and KPIs, no, located, and would anyone be able to access it, no? Again, even insiders, typically you want to do segregation of duties, no? To isolate that one user could only access this part of the component of Open RAN, another user could only access this. So it's gonna be no single user could cause ideally a huge impact on the environment. But of course, the heads of this department could also go rogue, no? But again, this is where the trust comes into play. If the CIO or CTO that had access to a lot more components, have gone rogue, and it has happened in the past. Uh, how do we protect, no, our critical infrastructure with that type of exposure? Okay. Like even simple, no, like tampering of this function descriptors, no, could cause degradation, no, or service denial. So this network information data, no, must of course be protected at all costs. And not every user, no, even internal ones, would need to have access, even just reading on it, no? Like for the network APIs, no, let's say the capacity, they would be able to determine it, and they could know at what point would a certain component would overload. You leave that to specific key personnel, no, that manages this. Then let's say for data storage protection, when storing sensitive data, is it encrypted? How is it encrypted? Encrypted at storage, encrypted with by field, no, in the database. Is this data restricted per function? Meaning, even if I had access to the database as a DB admin, I won't have access to the keys. So while I might be able to back up this database, I won't have the capacity to read it. Because well, it is encrypted in a secure fashion, no? Like hardware security modules or other TPM chips, no, incorporated. And in case the data goes um or in case the data had issues, no, the DB admin could also restore it. Again, data would be useless for the DB admin because it cannot read, no, those information since it is encrypted and restricted per function. And the restrictions per se, no, in case let's say you have one big database and various components are using it, no, that specific database, we could have specific table restrictions or even field restrictions that component A could only access the table 1 on database X, and then component B, no, could only access table 2. Again, depending on their how do you call this, access control, no, for that module. So gone are the days where you have one admin username password in a database and you are reusing it across various components. Because again, we're trying to compartmentalize them, and if case one of open components gets compromised, you want the threat actor to have very limited access. And ideally, you minimize their dwell time, where you would be able to detect that there's something wrong, someone has access that's not intended, and you kick them out of the network and do remediation as soon as possible. Yeah. For access control, well, yeah, mentioned this that they are in relation to the database kanina, example. They are now, I'm not sure if being mandated, but MFA and strong password policies, no, are a major requirement for Open RAN. So, well, again, even for various systems, no, it's 2023. I would say that if you don't have MFA on your emails and VPN, I would constitute that as a negligence. No, you should have MFA. Now, having MFA does not mean it's phishing resistant, no, phishing proof. It is phishing resistant, but it could still be phished, but it's a lot better than just with the username and password, no, to gain access to a system. No? So this is, I would say, strongly advised technology to be implemented within Open RAN. Of course, apply least principle of least privilege using role-based access controls, no? As an example kanina din sa data storage protection on database. You also want to do no and assess no software and artifacts lifecycle. Like if you have components in your Open Run, no, is this module no being delivered to us in a secure manner? Let's say if it's that we're downloading this from the internet, is it being downloaded via HTTPS? This is encrypted. And once we have that package, before we apply it to the system, no, is it signed and is the system actually verifying that digital signature before it's being accepted to add features no, or patch a vulnerability in our system? So if not, then that means there are issues with how the vendor no, is deploying patches and fixes no, on our systems. Of course, there's also version control. So we would know no, when was the system patch, what version was the old one, and what's the version on the new one, and reason. No? Why was it actually patched in the first place? No? Is there security vulnerability? Is there a feature that we need? And who did it? No? Which user account did it? So this is, I would say, a requirement no? When doing risk assessment for SMOs, since, well, you need to be able to determine when was the system patched. Let's say a vulnerability was disclosed today, and based on our policies and procedures, no, we would be able to patch it in 5 days. No? But due to some reason, we were able to patch it in 2 weeks. So you have a 2 week window, and in case you were really able to patch it and something goes wrong, no, you could assess na, yeah, something might have happened within that 2 weeks na that allowed the threat actor to gain access to our infrastructure or even just a component. So this information like version control and supply chain control really does help no? Our assessment on what risk and exposure are various components of our Open Run exposed to. There's also, of course, yung safe CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment practices. So if you have a code, you want to deploy it, this is typically seen on DevSecOps. They publish it, they have a lot of tests no, before it even goes into ready for production push. We've seen cases where their CI/CD process is being infected. No? And on one of those testing phases, no, they were injecting no, some backdoors before being pushed into production. And yeah, I mentioned this kanina, anti-tampering of techniques using digital signatures where various components before being applied is the system actually validating this digital signatures, and of course is the vendor actually signing yung mga components that we're applying to our system. Orchestration risk, we have ORAN does not want and cannot replicate the work done by other SDOs regarding orchestration, mentions of ETSI and Network Function Virtualization Framework on the ONAF framework for ORAN orchestration and slicing. So also attacks related to orchestration can be sophisticated as to manipulate service logic or aim service degradation and that. And I would say they are targeting the automation aspect of Open Run, and if a threat actor had access to the orchestration, it's basically game over. So for what it's worth, no, most of them would want to stay on the background and just observe. But if it comes to it, they could easily destroy your infrastructure because the orchestration component basically controls everything. No? So this is one of the critical components of Open Run where if someone had access to this, they could nuke the infra. Okay. I'll breeze through this since medyo haba din actually yung course no since this is a walkthrough. And then we have the OCloud no components but this would be also no being discussed dito sa ORAN Security Focus Group no. There's a study on OCloud 2.0. This is around 95 pages which would require roughly around 4 hours. Sorry, 5 hours of reading. Um, bypass this, no? O1 interfaces, yung mga scope, security, controls, and then risk niya, discussion. Then you have the O2 interfaces. Yeah, for O1 and O2, it's most likely yung mga security controls niya, no? It's just TLS, no? Encrypt everything to protect, no, against confidentiality, integrity, and availability. No? But yeah, from risk of denial of service, for the most part, no one could actually protect you from it. You just need to isolate the environment. If someone had access to that, even just sending traffic, no, they could cause outage or signal degradation. Hence, let's say on the risk ng auto interface, no, denial of service is really a concern. Hence, the topology and design should consider that. So it could easily be isolated. For rigs and apps, no, again, service degradation against user equipments, no, or wholesales, no, so they could not just start altering policies, no, and enrichment information, no, because I think classic example nito was there was a guy in I think Germany who wanted to prove, no, that traffic data could be manipulated. So what he did was he had a lot of mobile phones, no, with Google Maps on, no, and he was just walking with all of these phones connected online in a cart. And of course, what Google would be sensing was there's a lot of users, no, on Google Map pretending to be a car that is slowly moving on specific streets. So even though there is no actual cars on the street, Google is detecting that, yeah, this street has a lot of cars, quote unquote, and they are moving slowly. So it concluded that there is a traffic, no, going on that street, where in fact it's just a user trying to manipulate the data being fed to the cloud. So that, I would say, might be something like altering of enrichment info, or even machine learning data poisoning. There's a lot of other skip it, and I'll go straight to ORAN security enforcement. So for security enforcement of ORAN, no, these are their recommendation, that of course you have a system, you want to conduct penetration testing to test yung mga security aspects of it. We do have an exercise in the course to set up vanilla Ubuntu and do basic vulnerability scanning, not full pen test, no? That alone could take a month, no, for that course. But if you are interested, no, there are references on where you might want to get training, no, for penetration testing. And it's different to test network infrastructure to a web application to an API call and even mobile applications. No? So there are some specialties in penetration testing, but the basic gist of why you're doing it, how you're doing it, is roughly the same. And the risk assessment too. It's how you do it and the tools required. No? It's gonna be different. So aside from security testing, no, before deployment and even during deployment, you want to detect. No? So all key components in OS and app level should be logged, and not only locally. Ideally, you send this to a central log aggregator or SIM platform. And then you now would have, no, all of these components sending you the log. You could now deploy use cases, no, and analytics, no, to detect attacks on your infrastructure. Like, is there a sudden spike of login failures, no, from a specific IP? So could be indicator that someone's trying to brute force your system. Or is there a login on weird time zones, no? Like 3 a.m., where most of our admins are 8 to 5 anyway. So is it a threat actor? Is it our user, no, performing maintenance during the wee hours of the morning? Or then we could add and do data enrichment, no? Is the login coming from our internal network or coming from country outside, let's say the Philippines, no? So you could now start doing these assessments and determine that, yeah, I am detecting a possible attack on our infrastructure. Also want to do protect, no? When deploying this Open RAN components, we want to prevent intrusion. No? So there are uh, tools and frameworks like the CIS and the NIST that could help us with this, and of course apply again zero trust philosophy. You might be deploying various components that's made by different vendors. The typical approach for these vendors is I am self-contained. I would process a request, but I will not trust that request initially. I had to validate it, no? If that request is as expected. Right? That's at least how they're claiming to be secure by design. Because if it's a malformed request being sent to them and they just blindly trust it, that is dangerous, no? And a recipe for disaster. So we also want for protection, proactive controls. Again, firewall for these various interfaces and components, web application firewall for API calls and web calls, and have some intrusion prevention system, no, either host-based or network-based, better for both. Again, you're doing defense in depth with this one. For the test specification recommendation, there are again various protocol. You've seen this four, no, kanina, the SSH, TLS, DTLS, and IPsec. You want to have an inventory, no, ng versions nila, what ciphers are supported, is the certificate management done properly and not just self-signed. And if it's self-signed, we control the certificate authority. Passwords natin, do we have password policies? Is it resistant against brute force? Which means typically you would be using around 16 characters. No? I think that's the recommendation now for password length in relation to password policy. They are somehow reducing, no, the password complexity policies. They are mainly after the length of the password. At least the standards. No? The complexity isn't really helpful, no, if you are still running the 8 characters alphanumeric with special characters, no. It could be easily cracked at this day and age, no, if that's your password policy. So at least NIST is recommending a lengthy password, even though it's all lowercase, no. But if it's 16 characters, it might take a few hundred years, no, to crack it with our current computing power. No? But an alphanumeric one, 8 characters, maybe a few hours. Hence, they are recommending to have very lengthy password. Do vulnerability scanning. This is you call this an activity for the course. And then while we're gonna just be doing infrastructure level, application level, there is a type of vulnerability scanning called fuzzing, which, well, just for definition, it typically takes a lot of time to do this. And of course, you don't want to fuzz, especially in production. You typically want to fuzz a software or a system while in a test environment. There is, of course, the threat of denial of service, but for the most part, there's nothing really much to protect. You could do to protect against this, especially if it's coming from the outside, but from the internal. Again, the WAF, the firewall, the segmentation that would help against your various interfaces from being hit by random traffic that's not even intended to be processed by those. Okay. And of course, there's a lot of many more areas now still being discussed. And this just basically tips the iceberg. So for zero trust, no, we'll have some discussion on it. Okay, just 2 slides. No? It was designed even in 1994. Basically, Google is also applying this to their own environment. That any device is not to be trusted by default. And again, even if they're connected to a sensitive network and all checks pass, even if they were previously verified, you do not trust them. You always validate any data that they are or activity that they're trying to do in the network. So, ayun, in the complex environment of Open RAN, no? Trusting devices, again, it's not, and components, no? It's not really uh, recommended. Again, you are dealing with components that is manufactured by different vendors. One of those could have been compromised or one of those could have vulnerabilities. So you want other systems and components to be ready and protected, no, in case one of them goes wrong. So Zero Trust, it's we have a National Cybersecurity Center, no, that has identified, no, key principles for this, like single strong source of user identity. You would typically be required to do uh, identity access management system to deploy and perform user authentication, machine authentication, and additional context, no, for policies like you are authenticating. Do you have MFA? Are you using your required machine? No? And does that machine have agents, antivirus, and patch level that is up to our standard before you're even authorized? And is that machine on a location that you are expected, like home, office, or maybe just geolocation based, no, country within the Philippines? Or are you logging in from, let's say, some country in South Africa? So, or South Africa. So that's not that's gonna hit some of this checks, no, and you would hit policy violation. And even though you have the password and you have your MFA, the system might decline, no, yung login. Okay. Um, for that, now we have a reading again. The NIST SP 800-207, which is basically the zero trust architecture, for you to have an idea what entails zero trust. And even though 59 pages, this is still just an intro for zero trust. Okay. Then we have next is defense in depth, where we are trying to defend, no, against virus attack, and in case something goes wrong, no, there is still another security control, no, that would protect against full on compromise. No? So let's say for this one, so you have physical defense and control, where no, not everyone could gain access to your premise. No? You have fence, you have guard dogs, you have CCTVs for deterrent. Then you have your technical controls. No? Yung hardware and software natin is restricted. We have, let's say, antivirus, uh, this encryption. If the data gets lost, you are being authenticated. So that's sample of technical controls. There's also admin controls like policies and procedures that could set the employee in trouble in case they have policy violations. Okay. Like let's say for hiring practices, do we do background checks? Do we validate the transcript? Do we validate previous employment? Data handling procedures. If you have the data, how do you process it? How do you destroy it? Who authorized the destruction? So those are also controls. Even though you don't have some administrative controls, ideally would have a corresponding technical control. No? So no one could just easily deviate from it. So principles again, uniform protection against across all networks, for part of this principle. No? They also want protected enclaves, no? Where you uh, segment sensitive and critical segments deeper in the organization. Meaning, let's say your database, no? You don't typically put that on the DMZ. It is protected within the internal network. Information centric, no? You are not protecting servers, you're protecting the information. Okay, and then you have, of course, threat vector analysis. No? If you have identified this risk, no, what controls do you have, no, on, let's say, an intrusion? No? So do you have firewall? Do you have a web application firewall? Do you have a host-based intrusion detection system? No? In case one of those components fail, may isa pang sasalo. Like, let's say for antivirus, no? Typically that's the last line of defense. No, come to think of it, no, last line of defense yung antivirus, because you have firewalls, you have intrusion detection system that those information would be coming from. And from emails. No, let's say from emails, you have email gateways, no, that does the scanning and checking ng source. If it's a spam, if the address is weird, and then even within the email system, you usually have your own antivirus there. No, very limited for the most part, but in case that threat actor still bypasses those controls, no, and it gets delivered to the user's inbox, no, ideally there are still some controls within the host, like an antivirus detecting that, yeah, this is a known malicious software, and in case it still bypasses the antivirus on the host, maybe you have an application whitelisting wherein the user inadvertently executed that attachment. The application whitelisting kicks in. No? Let's say that, okay, this software is not on the allowed list. It doesn't look malicious, but it's not on the allowed list, so I'm not gonna even start executing this. And that would have protected a lot of control organization against a major compromise. Again, you have a lot of controls, so you don't stop. No, let's say I'm protecting my network. I have a border firewall. That's okay. No, no. Even internal network, you segment them, you firewall them, and even outgoing traffic from your network. It's not ideal anymore. I would say it's mandatory that you filter outgoing traffic. We were taught for the past 30 years, no, that we could define, no, granular controls for data coming into our network. But if you see yung a lot of deployments, no, outgoing is heavily unrestricted. So if some machine gets compromised, it could easily call back to sa threat actor. So ideally, no, I would say mandatory. No, we need access control lists of for the data, no, coming out of our infrastructure. So that could easily filter then. And any violation, no, it's not unexpected traffic, but it hits a block, no, we could easily investigate. Why is this uh, Open RAN component trying to connect to a machine, no, on outside the network? So we could see that. Okay. So for defense in depth, no, this is a bit dated. It's 2016, but still very relevant for industrial control systems, no, like critical infrastructure and especially communications. No? This is 58 pages. We estimate it to be 3 hours for discussion. And then we have principles of least privilege, sample implementation. No? Like you regularly review, no, and adjust user permissions and access rights that they still align, no, with current job roles. So this is becoming an issue on an employee na medyo matagal na sa organization, no, and moves, no, to different departments and roles. Typically, nire-retain yung roles kasi they still have something to do on yung previous task nila, and aside from retaining, no, nakakalimutan na. So the review would be needed to detect this, no. And let's say a sample of policy, no, that I typically want implemented on any environment that I am managing is, if there's a user account that hasn't logged in for a week, I would automatically disable it. No, not delete, no, just disable, no. Then sabi na, paano mo kung nag-leave lang ng 2 weeks, no, or maternity leave? Then I would actually say that if naka-leave ka, your account should have been actually disabled, no. Naka-link ka na sa HR system kasi you shouldn't be logging in anyway. So that policy na that auto disables the account after a certain number of days without login, it does help as an additional control in case some of these accounts fell through, no, the defense in depth. At least at mo mag-auto disable yung account. And in case the user really needs to log in, no, he would notify service desk, no, na, yeah, I had my account, I think it's locked out kasi hindi ako naka-log in for X number of days, so please re-enable it. And the service desk won't even change the password for the user, no. I-re-enable lang yan as the assumption that the user knows the password and naka-MFA siya. Okay. So sample implementation ng principle of least privilege. Next, we have NIST Cybersecurity Framework. This is being recommended by Open RAN as a framework for the cybersecurity practice, no, and posture of Open RAN. And it has 5 components. No? It's the identify. Again, you cannot protect what you don't know. And then, of course, start protecting those systems. And then you, of course, want to protect it. You want to detect any anomalies. And if you have seen anomalies, you want to respond and remediate it, and then of course recover operations. No? So yeah, these are generic terms understood by even non-security people, no, on risk management, on um, we could actually apply it, no, to life, no, not really only to Open RAN, no, even various IT. It's designed to be generic enough to be applied to any organization, no, and even personal life. So just discussions on the NIST. So there is NIST cybersecurity framework, version 1.1. I think the version 2 is released. On the next version, of course, we're gonna be, of course, upgrading na yung mga documentation on what is latest. Okay. Yeah, I think version 2 is already released at this point since okay. Next, we have CIS, Critical Security Controls. Basically, it stemmed from 20 critical controls before, no? But they were able to consolidate it to 18. And what this is um, it helps the organization to identify which controls do they have, which controls are they lacking, and ideally, if you could implement these 18 controls in a good automated fashion, no, you would be protected against this one. So nation states, financially motivated attackers, commodity malware, and even script kiddies. No? So what happened here was there was a lot of security professionals, no, from CIA, NSA, private industries, banking in the US, and they were put in a room by the SANS Institute and have them discuss, no, what were the common avenues that actors gets in your network, and for the NSA, how do you get inside that network? Um, and what could have prevented that? No? And they were able to identify initially 20, no? But now they were able to collapse some two of it, and now they are doing at least on the latest version 8, which was released I think this year. No, they were able to consolidate it to 18. So we have here 18 critical security controls. I have a reading requirement, no, on this. But on the basic sense, no, even the number 1 and number 2, if you could see, no, inventory control of enterprise assets and inventory control of software assets. It just simply means that the asset inventory is the core of security because it's hard to protect against something that you don't know exists in your network. No? So you have those top two, and even that top two, again, think of your own scenario. Do you actually know ilang machines meron sa environment nyo and what softwares are running on those machine? And not only what software, what versions? If we cannot answer that in a sound and quick fashion, we have problem with inventory. And all of these other controls would fail without those two. So, yep. And to have that, no, there is an audit script where it's Excel based. If you could see below, no, may mga tab siya against certain critical security controls, and there are questions and maturity level, no, per questions like this one. This is for number 1. No? Do you have an asset inventory? If someone plugs on your network, could you easily identify it and detect it? And then you just initially you're trying to comply with this. Do you have policy for it? Diba? So if doon pa lang wala ng policy, you have identified the gap. You need to have a policy, okay? And that would be basically doon magbe-base yung mandate to get resources and technology for that. And ideally, you have it automated. And you'll have a score per critical security controls, no? And if you go back dun sa main, no? You have 1 to 18, you have percentage, no, on where you're good at, where you're bad, and the visualization helps, no, to identify which control, no, do we want to put our resource, wherein let's say we have minimal resource, no, which of this control we could afford and would have a high impact on our security maturity, no. So that's how I would frame where you would put this, and you could use this to evaluate your Open RAN deployments. And with that, no, there is a critical security controls version 8 documentation. You'll have to register and download, though. It's 87 pages, but it does explain how do you assess and how do you implement no controls no for those 18 critical security controls. Okay. And as part of CIS, we have I think the last component nito benchmarks where you are being described no how to set up a server no at least on this one it's a component it's an Ubuntu machine. How do you set up to be secure no for deployment in let's say it doesn't necessarily send open run no? But it's for generic deployment. How do you lock down an Ubuntu system? Some of this might not be applicable, but it's a good exercise for you know, this for the student no to set up install a workstation Ubuntu and then set it up and we'll have as part of exercise no install an Ubuntu the lower version is still better no? For support lang but you could do Ubuntu 22 if you want and then we're estimating 2 hours to set it up and then around 8 hours no to read the benchmark for Ubuntu 20 or 22 and then implement these components. You could download no that documentation and it's not only for Ubuntu no if you want to learn about securing Cisco routers switches Windows Apple devices like Macs and iOS they have this list no and even securing databases no? Then after you've done that we got a short exercise of conducting a vulnerability scan no? Using two methods, authenticated and unauthenticated. And best to scan, no? A vanilla Ubuntu without a CIS benchmark policies applied, and then the one that's hardened. Then use Tubo. No? Then you'll document the findings kung na-secure ba or hindi. Okay, and yeah, that's the last for puro mga key takeaways, multi-vendor run, okay, and yeah, uh, key learning points. So yeah, I think that's it.